Hi, and welcome to Drafting Compliance. I'm Kayne, he's Tom, and we talked with your brother about AI last time. Today, we're talking about an article that I wrote about the future of auditing. But before we get to that, we have some beers. What are we drinking today, Tom?
Yeah, this is going to be new for both of us. I don't think you've had
I've
it
not
anyway.
had this.
This is called Cadence. Yeah, it's called Cadence. It's a Belgian-style ale. So, for those of us that are into the hop count in a beer, this will be a completely different sort of like ambiance around the hop. In IPAs here in the United States, we get this sort of like piney and grapefruity character. This will be completely different than that because it's noble
for something
hops.
Different, and it's got it's by Reformation.
Something
Brewery.
Different.
That's big. I guess that's what the big R.
I believe they're out of Ohio.
Okay. Hello from Ohio, or hello to Ohio. Yeah. No, it says North Georgia. North Georgia. Yeah.
Oh, North Georgia made.
Yeah, I get new glasses and suddenly I can read things. It's fun. Let's crack this open and see what actually happens, Tom. It's a okay. It's a can, so.
Oh, there's a distinct smell.
It smells like
it's usually Belgian style ales. In my experience, are much more clear, lighter looking. So this is me a little excited. Like maybe we're going to see something completely different here, Kayne.
You think this is going to be?
It pours with a really nice head on it.
Trained me well. If nothing else, my next career as a bartender, I will be able to pour beers, if nothing else. So that's kind of what it looks like for the camera there. I cannot entirely
now, if you put your nose to this,
even if I put it up to a light.
Yeah, it's pretty opaque. Yeah. I'm surprised by that. Like I said, that's not typical in my experience. There's really strong banana smell to me.
Yeah, I can get some banana and maybe something beer adjacent. It's definitely not, I think the term is hoppy. It doesn't smell hoppy, which is promising.
You see, that's the opposite of promising in my world.
It's just a matter of perspective, isn't it? So yeah, let's go ahead and
let's
see
go
how
in
it
for
tastes.
a taste.
So far on the nose, it's not offensive, at least, which is a good sign.
Much more earthy than many of the beers that we drink. You can taste the banana a little too.
Yeah. Okay, that exists.
Slightly sweet.
I get the banana. It's not the worst thing we've had on the show. I'll give it that. It is definitely not the cinnamon bun sticky ale. And if you're watching on YouTube and you don't remember that episode, this is why Tom never allows me to buy beer anymore. We had cinnamon bun sticky ale. Stickies. I think that was the title of it. It was freaking terrible. This, I guess, if bananas are your vibe, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's got that. That's a hop. I would also go as far as say it's a little earthy, almost. I don't know. Maybe hay comes to mind. You probably haven't spent as much time as I have on a farm, so maybe you don't.
No, it's also not very bubbly. I'll point that out. It's not.
Yeah, it loses it right away.
It's pretty much done with being bubbles. It's almost still. So yeah, it's banana water, brown banana water. Really selling it, aren't I? Here.
Yeah, and it's sweet. I think it's pretty good so far.
The sweet just keeps going too.
All right, let's talk.
Yeah, so we are facing new regulatory requirements like NIS2 and DORA in the EU, as well as we're seeing potential state-by-state regulations in the United States, and also the ongoing challenges of FedRAMP. So how do you think companies should be adjusting their audit readiness strategies to handle this increasing level of complexity, Tom?
Yeah, Kayne, that's actually a really good question because I think a lot of companies are starting to struggle with this. And certainly if they've gone down the FedRAMP path, they're struggling with it. But again, you mentioned DORA, and I think DORA was literally a right-hand hook to a lot of companies. Like, I don't think they understood how that might impact them. I think a lot of folks heard DORA and heard its financial institutions and probably tuned out right away. And the reality is anybody providing services to financial institutions are also going to be impacted by DORA in a pretty significant way. So I think it's left people scrambling. And certainly as we got to the deadline for these organizations to be things like DORA compliant, right? Which is not a decision that they made initially, right? They happen to have customers and that decision gets made for them. They're starting to understand what it is that they have to do, right? And so they're, one of the things that I see a lot of organizations do is they go out and they look for somebody who can help fill the gaps in quickly for them. And in the GRC market, that probably means you're finding a trusted third party of some kind to do that. You're helping. They're coming in to help organizations understand what does a regulation mean directly to them and indirectly. So in the case of financial institutions, it's pretty clear what directly DORA is going to do for them. In the case of FedRAMP, it's pretty clear directly what it's going to do to them. But then to extrapolate that to what if you're a service provider to an organization that's either DORA compliant or FedRAMP, right? That's where those third parties come in and are really, really good at helping you understand right away, what does this mean for our strategy? What are the best practices we need to implement? What are the priorities we need to go after? Those kinds of things. But I also don't want to gloss over that there's tools in place today that significantly help this body of people do their work as well, right? So, we happen to work at one of them, a centralized platform for GRC. When you have something like that in place and you've already deployed something like maybe a common controls framework, you can walk more rapidly and start to do that gap analysis for yourself on an emerging platform an emerging framework. So I would encourage folks, if they haven't done that, to get there as quickly as they can, because that's really going to help them, in lieu of bringing in that third party, or maybe to just set the table for a third party. That's going to help them.
The other thing I think about, Tom, and listening to all of that is that it's not just a technology problem. Like, obviously technology can be used to automate a lot of this and reduce some of the burden. But I think ultimately, of a conversation I had a couple days ago with an attorney, and what he was saying was that at a lot of organizations, he's been brought in as external counsel to help them evaluate what is their regulatory burden, what is their legal burden, what is their contractual burden. And when I think of audit readiness, I think we have to understand that doesn't just mean external regulatory controls that might be extraterritorial, like DORA, for example, or NIS2 or FedRAMP, but also the right of customers to audit their suppliers or companies in their supply chain. That's something we frequently see. And I think a lot of companies, especially just based on that conversation with the attorney I had, as well as a lot of other conversations I've had, companies don't know what they have signed up for. I think that's one of those lessons that we're learning, is that for better or for worse, companies will sign contracts that require them to do certain things, and they might just YOLO it, right? They might just, it's the deal that they have to get to bring in the quarter to get the thing to happen. And consequently, they have suddenly new requirements. Those might be procedural requirements, they might be cybersecurity requirements, they might be privacy requirements, whatever the requirements there are. And the funny thing is, I don't think a lot of companies, especially in the mid-market and particularly startups, I don't think they really think through that. Is that a fair assessment of the market today?
I think that is a fair assessment. I spend a significant portion of my time reviewing contracts. And the reality is if you're not doing that, you're going to get caught up in a bunch of one-off situations that you don't necessarily understand you're getting caught up in. And you mentioned something that I want to go back and sort of ruminate on, and that's, you talk to a friend that's in legal. And I don't know that every organization necessarily thinks, I should go to legal to talk about these things, but that's exactly where you should go, because legal has the ability to distill things like an emerging framework down to risk, and help you inform sort of your own strategy around those risks, right? And if nothing else, have them do a cursory review of anything that's emerging on your plate in terms of a new framework or even a business decision that may come with regulatory burden. Help them by informing them so they can tell you where your risk might lie. My legal folks are invaluable to informing me. And also, when I review these documents, contracts, DPAs, I often send them over to legal to review as well, because what happens is they see a risk that specific language differs enough around that I don't see it as it's just a lowly CISO. but certainly they're trained to read the language and understand the language
Yeah, and I
better
think
than we
that's a
are.
really
So
good point
use
there.
them.
So, first lesson learned out of this podcast really is that, first of all, I'm looking at this now, looks like a glass of iced tea on my desk here. But the other thing is go talk to your attorneys,
Mine's going
please.
down.
Make friends with counsel, if nothing else. If you're a CISO, even if you're senior cybersecurity, maybe you're not the CISO, go talk to your attorney. Be friends. Go have a cup of coffee. Do not have a cup of this. And understand that relationship will allow you to better interpret and also to better limit both your organizational's requirements as well as, I'd say, your personal liability for being the person who might have signed something. But I want to move on, Tom. So something that I'd mentioned in the article was in our IT benchmark survey that we release annually, we found that 59% of organizations now test all their controls rather than just the most important ones. So what's your perspective on that shift, and have we made similar changes?
Yeah, well, if you think about where we came from as an organization, right? How Hyperproof was founded, we were founded on one of the premise being that continuous monitoring of
Right.
controls was the future. That was what 6.5 years ago. We are now seeing it as a definite kind of foundational element in what compliance looks like in 2025. So it's definitely a true statement. We definitely are seeing folks move towards continuous monitoring. You start to look at some of the things that are being pushed in the continuous monitoring kind of
Mm-hmm.
ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
things like OSCAL, right? These things are built specifically to help enable the consumption of continuous monitoring. So it should help you be informed that regulatory bodies are starting to look at continuous monitoring as a requirement as well. And certainly we see that with FedRAMP. So that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. A good way to think of it is, in 2005, we were pretty comfortable saying, hey, we monitor compliance as a point in time. In 2025, there is no point in time monitoring anymore. The expectation is continuous monitoring. And really, the expectation for security should be continuous monitoring as well, right? So this shouldn't be
But
a
I think
surprise to
also
anybody.
there's a
And then,
differentiation here, and I want to disambiguate just to also drop a $5 word into the conversation.
sure.
The continuous monitoring you're talking about is not the same as the continuous monitoring as in FedRAMP, which is something we often have talked about this show, right? Because I think that's a conflation of terms there. Like we're talking about all the controls, regardless of framework, whether it's a legal control, whether it's a regulatory control, whether it's a contractual control, continuous observation that those controls are working. Whereas in FedRAMP, it has a very different meaning, and it typically means like eyes on glass, and you've got humans that are actually looking at your log files. Not just that the control is working, but somebody's actually operating the control continuously as well. Is that a fair way of thinking about that?
Well, I would say there's more overlap than maybe you realize, because a lot of what you have to report out to the government is proof of your continuous monitoring, right? So it's evidential proof that you're doing your continuous monitoring. So it's things like, hey, have I done all of my vulnerability scans? Yes, I can show you I've done all my vulnerability scans. Have I recorded those vulnerability scans to POAM? I send them the POAM. Yes, I've done that. These are all controls that are continuously monitored, along with a slew of others, right? So the overlap is significant. Remember, FedRAMP is just NIST, so it's a best practice for security, whether or not you're working with the FedRAMP body or not. So there is some overlap where I would say what you and I both think of as continuous monitoring in the normal compliance world is also applicable to the FedRAMP world. And really, the point that I'm getting at is the thought process around continuous monitoring is now starting to be driven by regulatory boards, and so it's not going to stay unique to FedRAMP. And things like OSCAL are enabling it to not stay unique to FedRAMP. As that language becomes more prevalent, and it isn't today, but as it does, I can see other frameworks start to pick that up and say, yeah, we would like to see evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Think of DORA in the EU. We'd like to see evidence of continuous monitoring on some routine basis, monthly or something like that.
Okay, so you're predicting, and I think it's probably a safe bet that we're going to see more of this, not less of this. And I think one of those influences I hate to bring it into the conversation. I bet there's probably people out there thinking, you know what? We've got AI. Let's AI all the things. Let's do AI continuous monitoring. So, Tom, how would you say the integration of AI and also more broadly, cloud technology, how has that changed your thinking about auditing and compliance in the past year?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As the CISO, I automatically start to worry when the term
Hmm.
AI comes up. But I also see tremendous like value in the technology. And the other half of me has to say, how do we enable things with AI in a responsible way, right? So we need to find that balance. When you pair it with cloud, and I think of cloud as tools like what we have, but there are other tools. But really, where the benefit comes in is you are able to collaborate with your auditors almost in real time. So it brings this collaborative capability to it. But it also brings on both sides of the fence, meaning on your internal audit side and your external audit side, it brings a level of insight that you haven't had before with AI. So for instance, on the internal side, you no longer have to worry that the sample that you pull is going to find some mistake. Between AI and continuous monitoring, you should have understanding of all the evidence you've collected and testing of that completed. So that's the benefit on the inside. On the outside, you can start to see patterns of behavior as an auditor where you still have to have a human check it. I hope. I mean, that's my desire. But you can start to see patterns of behavior over a larger data set, where before you're confined to a very small data set. So I think it allows for a more complete audit as well. And if you're more prepared on the inside, you should welcome a more complete audit on
I
the
think you bring
outside.
up a really interesting point there, Tom, that I want to poke at just a little bit. I was at a conference last year in Orlando, and I was talking to one of the senior muckety mucks, actual job title, of a big four accounting firm about their plans for AI. And it sounds fairly similar to what you're describing, where the person I was talking to was saying they were planning on using artificial intelligence to do a lot of the routine evidence sampling. And because they have
Absolutely.
such a fairly large data set, they might be able to do faster anomaly detection, faster pattern detection, and be able to identify systemic issues that affect multiple customers, which might inform how they're doing auditing. So that way, in theory, they could spend their time auditing the stuff that really matters as opposed to auditing all the other stuff. But I think the challenge, and I wasn't able to get resolution at the conference last year, was how do you know it's right? How do you make sure that it's not just full on hallucinating and coming up with facts that don't exist? And I think that's going to be one of the questions that we look in 2025 is what is the success rate of this, right? I've seen a recent report
Right.
that said organizations that last year said, yeah, we're doing the AI thing. Look at us, we're doing the AI thing, have had a 40% failure rate of their projects where they've done the demo, they found out that it worked in the trial period, and then they discontinue it because they realize it doesn't work in prod. It doesn't scale, it introduces inaccuracies. And that's, if nothing else, I'd say, to have, like, if you're thinking of using AI in your compliance program, cool, have a human in the loop, have a knowledgeable human in the
That's
loop.
right.
Like, don't take your person who just graduated out of college and put them in that role of checking what the AI says, because I think we've seen a lot of people will just trust what the AI says because it's clearly smart, and it's not, right? Is that a fair assessment, Tom?
I think that's very fair. I think of sort of like the AI deployment around almost anything, but certainly your compliance program is it certainly applies to as sort of a crawl,
Hmm.
walk, run model, right? Right now, our crawl is hey, it can go out and it can look at data and give some suggestions, but we should be doing pretty substantial fact checking on that. I consider walk being, hey, we start to let it do some routine things like, hey, it can suggest policy changes and make those in real time, and you just have to approve them. So there's still a check on it, but it's not nearly the level that you had. Certainly, run is at least probably 18 to 24 months away in my mind for any major platform with AI, and that's where you should be allowing it to do anything without a human check, even if it's routine. So I hesitate to let AI be sort of let loose in any organization today, but certainly we can see a future, I think, where we start to see some bigger benefit out of it. It's a big mistake today to start like large scale removing people from your organization in favor of AI, because AI still is a very fallible technology.
I think I agree with you on that point, Tom. And I want to say, if you're enjoying this conversation on YouTube, go ahead and ring the bell in order to get notifications about my quest to find any beer that's drinkable, or subscribe to this in your podcast app of choice to make the show part of your monthly routine. So, Tom, moving from AI, let's draw in that friend of mine who I was talking to is at a consultancy, right? What role do you see for external consultants in the audit preparation process?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about this kind of at the start. When you think about the complexity that's starting to hit a lot of organizations, particularly ones that work maybe in the United States and the EU, or work commercial space and federal space, the layers of complexity are growing, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. So you can really kind of up your game in a cost-effective way by bringing in external, trusted advisors, both specifically in the compliance space, and again, as I mentioned, in the legal space. Those guys can come in and sort of fill in the gaps of what your knowledge is, help you uncover risk associated with a strategic direction, but also better inform your future strategy. So don't discount the value of an objective third eye in that scenario, because it's invaluable. And then, to talk a little bit about what our industry looks like right now, we are increasingly having fewer and fewer people go into GRC. Our GRC body of talented people is aging, and it's getting smaller. So you also need to look at, hey, are there good partners out there that I can leverage just to help me cover my current talent gap that I might have in an organization? And I think increasingly the answer is going to be that's where we go for those resources to fill short-term needs, especially, but potentially even to fill a long-term contract as you fill an FTE, because that process takes longer now.
What I'm thinking about there, though, is there's still a demarcation line of responsibility, right? So let's say that you realize that you cannot compete for talent because there's just not enough GRC talent out there, Tom. And let's say you decide to bring in an external third party. Maybe you bring in an MSSP, and they say, hey, we're going to do some of your compliance and some of your audit preparation for you. I still think there has to be a fairly concise and pointy conversation about whose responsibility it is. And I think ultimately for a lot of companies, that's going to come back to the control operators. They're going to be responsible for saying, here's how we operated the controls, here is evidence that we operated the controls, but that's not necessarily the same as compliance. I think that the individual business, and again, this is going to come back to go talk to your chief legal officer or go talk to your general counsel, where they're going to have the ability to say, yes, this looks okay. And the reason I'm thinking about that is, like, let's say we go back to Sarbanes-Oxley, which is where we really started to see the sharp, pointy bits come out from the federal government, and we saw a few elbows thrown. I'm thinking of a couple companies that had a fairly bad time, Enron and WorldCom, just to drop names there for those. Yeah, exactly, right? Like if we had outsourced all of the evidence of control operation and all of the evidence of the that they were doing what they said they were going to do, as well as the attestation, as well as the certification. I can't think of a third party that's going to say, yeah, we're going to totally YOLO it. We're going to take your responsibility from you. We're going to absolve you of any mistakes. I think that that's one of those understandings we have to have when we bring in those external parties, is that they can report on what you show them. They can report on what they see. They can't say that that's everything. And I think that that's going to be a challenge contractually for companies that, like, we go back to your point, Tom, there not being enough people. That doesn't absolve you of the risk. You still have to have confidence that they are operating the controls and that you're showing them truthfully everything that's material for the audit.
Yeah, that's a great point. When you think about your liability, there's very little an organization can do to shift off the liability of the product and the service they offer, including hiring a third party. The only places where I can really think it's applicable would be things like PCI. You can hire an outside processor and shift much of your PCI. And, there's things like that happen. But internally, your security, your controls, and your compliance, that's your liability, that's your risk, and you have to assume it. What that really means in tactical practice is where you slot an external in matters. Meaning you should think of them as advisors, or they're doing very routine work, but they are not owning controls. So they're sort of at the opposite ends where I tend to slot that kind of help in. Opposite ends of the spectrum of the work you're doing. The advisory role, they're literally interfacing with you as a leader, helping you be informed, showing you your risk, uncovering and summarizing things like new frameworks that might impact you. That's the top end. At the low end, they're doing the very rote work, right? The stuff that's very repeatable. They're collecting data, they're analyzing it, but they're leaving it to you to analyze the risk associated and own the liability.
I think that's a fair point there. So I want to go back to something else we talked about just at the beginning of the show, because I'm thinking of, like, let's say we've got all of these different audit frameworks that we have to attest to. We've got NIS2, we've got DORA, we've got FedRAMP, we might have other contractual obligations. We just talked about bringing in external partners to help offload some of the work. So how are we handling the challenge of managing multiple audits simultaneously while avoiding the duplication of work across departments or external third parties?
Yeah, there's a lot there to talk about, right? Certainly having third parties helps you inform on those things, but in terms of doing the actual work, there's a couple things. There's the pre-work side of it, right? You've got to inform your folks of the shift and the new audits and what that means to them. If there's new risk, that's where your security, like awareness training and things, all comes into practice. But in practice, the actual tactical work that you do in platform, for instance, you better centralize your platform because it brings all kinds of benefits to you. You should use a common control framework because it's extensible to multiple frameworks. The big secret in the compliance world is there is a lot of overlap
I don't know
between
if that's
frameworks,
a secret,
right?
Tom. I think
So
that's
take
kind
it.
of a stated fact.
Yeah, that's right. So take advantage of that fact and use the same control on multiple frameworks. And certainly a platform like ours can help with that. And then when it comes to the real work of audit, things where you're collecting evidence and you're, putting that evidence in front of auditor and you're defending it in some cases, having all that collected into a single platform makes that very easy, makes that very fast. And if you can layer on testing on top of that, so some automated testing to your proof, suddenly the daunting task of taking an additional framework on, when you have a common controls framework, it's all centralized and you have collection and testing on top of it, that becomes a not minuscule is not the right word. It becomes a minimal ask to bring on an additional framework because you may be taking a body of controls. Common controls take 85% of it, and suddenly you're only having to solve for that 15% gap. It's a much smaller ask.
But I can still think of executives out there saying, well, this is still a lot of work, right? This is a cost. A lot of companies still see audit as a cost center. They don't see it necessarily as a strategic advantage, and they don't see it as a something that's they get excited about. They don't want to resource it appropriately occasionally. They see it as something they have to do. And I think a lot of that is driven by the perception of there being duplication of work, like we just talked about, as well as other inefficiencies where they're going to say, well, this isn't the most efficient way of doing this. So what specific inefficiencies have we identified in current audit processes? And are there any technologies that have been helpful in addressing those inefficiencies?
Good question. I feel like I'm at risk of being repetitive with this a little bit. Certainly the biggest efficiency gain that we've seen is in centralizing a platform, right? So having everything centralized under one platform, being able to look at a very common control. Let me think of one. Encryption, for instance. I think almost every framework asks for an encryption standard to be in place at a certain level. Most companies, certainly a SaaS company like me, we have that encryption standard in place. That's a control that has been in place since day one. So how can I take that control and apply it across all frameworks, right? You have to have a control-centric platform, but other than that, it's pretty easy to deploy that across all your frameworks, and it takes all the work associated with the new framework away from you. So that's a huge efficiency. But you also can't sort of marginalize the value of being able to kind of crosswalk an entire program to another, because you have that where you get the benefit of the common controls because those will crosswalk with you. You also get the benefit of the analysis associated with the gaps that are left behind. And if I go back to when we were Sarbanes-Oxley, this is at another organization. I was at Bridgestone for years, Sarbanes-Oxley, and we started to talk about things like ISO. That was a daunting ask. I mean, the idea that we would take on ISO when we're doing all this work for Sarbanes-Oxley just seemed like a bridge too far to me. With something like Crosswalk in place, in minutes, I can get a gap analysis of our current control set and what would it mean to crosswalk to another organization or another framework for the organization. So that you just can't minimize what that means for an organization. I'll take this just a minute here, Kayne, to kind of plug my belief too that reciprocity in these frameworks needs to happen, because we wouldn't need as much sort of hand wringing on new ventures for the organization in terms of what it means for us from a compliance perspective if we would get true reciprocity and we would get different frameworks to acknowledge the work that you're doing in another framework. And it just doesn't
Yeah, and I
exist
think
today.
of that especially when I was reading about what my neighbors to the north, some of you know I live fairly close to Canada, and they are not doing CMMC the same way that we're doing CMMC domestically. And one of the biggest differences they have, sorry to go down a CMMC rabbit hole on here, but just for a quick moment, CMMC in the United States is based on Rev 2. NIS 171, Rev 2. CMMC, which is not called CMMC, it's something else in Canada, is based on Rev 3. There is a difference of over 100 controls. There are also some controls that are missing. And Tom, going to your point, there's no reciprocity between the two. So the challenge that I see there, this is true for a lot of industries, where if you're an organization that serves both the United States as well as Canada, and you have to be CMMC compliant in this example, you have two very divergent standards that have got some common history between the two. But because there's that lack of reciprocity, it's certainly, I think that is in itself an inefficiency. But also, I think that really perpetuates that idea that executives have of like, why are these things different? They all say about the same things. This seems fairly
Yeah.
inefficient.
Yeah, very inefficient. And then you realize that the NIST standards are based upon a body that the United States should be very closely aligned to, and you wonder why we aren't based upon version 3 either. Like the whole thing doesn't make sense, Kayne. So yeah, when it comes to government, it's hard for me to even rationalize why we do certain things. But I think an easy thing to do is release some reciprocity standards, some communicated language that says, hey, if you're doing this, we believe you're also doing that. So you don't really need to comply with both frameworks. That would be helpful.
Yeah, I think so. And I think bringing that back to your earlier point on having the ability to continuously at least know that you are compliant, I think that does help, even if you do have to meet multiple different divergent standards without reciprocity. And that's something I talked about in the article as well, where I emphasize the value of continuous controls monitoring. What are some of the benefits that you've seen from implementing real-time monitoring of controls?
Yeah, it's huge. On the internal audit side, we're not a huge group, and lots of organizations are struggling with finding talent or keeping budget to keep talent. So anything you can do to drive efficiency into that sort of scenario is beneficial, and that's what continuous monitoring can do for you. It's going to be automated, so it collects all that evidence for you. So it takes a huge burden off personnel. I think of some of the things that I've had people do in my past, right, where they would literally go through and do a checklist on a Windows implementation once a quarter. just to make sure it was doing the same thing that it was always doing.
I'm just laughing because I'm
right?
thinking of Stig's here at this point, Tom.
Yeah, or go and collect the config off of TACAX once a quarter. So you could do a compare on the last one you took. This is extremely time consuming. It's not huge value because you should be able to automate it, but beforehand nothing was automated, so you had to do it. So just the ease of control testing now compared to what it was 10 years ago it's enormous, and it creates huge efficiencies for your group. I mean, to the point where you can really contemplate a budget cut because you have so much work being completed automatically for you. That translates very quickly to the external audit. So your ease of audit becomes a huge differentiator from the life that you used to live. So if you have everything centralized, you have all your collections centralized, and you have the monitoring on top of it centralized, you know before you go into an external audit, you know your stance for readiness. You don't have to worry that the auditor is going to find something. Meaning, if you're doing continuous monitoring correctly, you have found all the little mistakes along the way and you've corrected them, you've improved the process. So when you sit before auditor, you don't have that oh no moment where you collect evidence with the auditor and he sees that something isn't as it should be. So it's huge. And the last thing is, you just have a huge opportunity to discover gaps in general. And that's a benefit to your security program, which we all know security is different than compliance. Compliance is all about proving your security, but security is a different target altogether. So when you can find gaps through your continuous monitoring on your security, your overall posture and your overall risk is in a much better position.
Yeah, and I want to double click on that there, Tom, just on the idea of risk, because I'd say as a CISO, having a real-time view of control operation is way more informative and comforting than having a quarterly or an old school annualized view of it. Because one of the things that I can think about when I was working with organizations previously were examples where the threat actor knew the audit schedule and they had persistence in the environment, and they knew when the box was going to get audited, and so they could just revert the configuration so that it would be the correct configuration, and then once the auditor had gone by, they could revert it back to what they'd been doing. And that's not an uncommon situation based on what I've seen in the environment. And I think that having that continuous view is it's analogous to that the check engine light on your dashboard, if nothing else, of your car, where if something goes out of true, you can investigate it, right? You have that real-time visibility that, hey, something's wrong here. Now, it might be a false alarm. Goodness knows, I think many of us who have cars have probably had the check engine light come on before, and then it was a mistake. And in other cases, it points to something that is a material risk that has increased. And I think that having that visibility through real-time monitoring has got to be way better than the old way of we'd wait to react. It allows us to be more proactive when reducing our risks rather than reactive. And I think to your point on auditors, I think that's it, like you said, it gives you a higher degree of confidence that they're not going to find something. Because if you've been proactively reducing those risks, if you've been proactively reducing all those check engine lights that come up that say, hey, this control is no longer operating as intended, I think that gives you a far better stance when going into an audit conversation, right?
Yeah, I agree completely. I want to rotate on one thing you said. If you're in leadership and you're feeling uneasy, that dashboard gives you a sense of peace because you understand in real time sort of where your overall environment sits. That's more important today than ever because we have seen where senior leadership is being held to account for anything sort of subpar, whether it's regulatory or security in terms of breach that happens in the organization's sort of infrastructure footprint. So not only does it give them a sense of ease in terms of, hey, our security is good, but it gives them a sense of ease in terms of where is my liability going to be if a regulator knocks on my door. That's a huge benefit.
Okay, cool. Well, I think that's probably, we've covered a lot in today's podcast. I want to move back to the beer reviews because I've been staring at this periodically. It has stopped bubbling. I'm gonna hold it up. I think this comes through on the light. It looks like iced tea at this point. It literally looks like
Yeah, it doesn't taste like
boy,
iced tea. I'll
you've
tell you
had
that.
quite a lot.
I've drank quite a bit because I was enjoying it. Yeah.
Yeah, the banana comes even stronger if you just leave it alone. True fact, I don't like bananas. So I may have some bias against this one, just to be, other than it being a beer, I may have some bias against this one.
Beer.
Weird, right?
Minus the banana, you already have a bias. Yeah. Go ahead and give your review, Kayne.
Well, it's flat now. And it kind of, earthy and sweet and like rotten bananas. I think that's what I'm going with here. It kind of tastes like a combination of dirt and rotten bananas. Flat as well, so there's not even bubbly. Having said that, I have a experience with beer now, Tom, and thank you for that. This continuing experience with beer. I'm going to give this a 3 out of 10. It is not. Right. It's certainly not a 1, but it's certainly not. I think we've had at least one better where I gave a 4. This is not so terrible, and it's mostly because it's not really pungent. It's not really offensive, but at the same point, bananas and rotten bananas and dirt. So if that's your vibe, this is probably great. Cadence beer from Reformation Brewery, who will not be dropping me a thank you note. Tom, what did you think of this?
Yeah. Well, I certainly have a much higher opinion than you. So the first thing that I would mention is this is a European style ale, which often sort of trend towards the farm style ales, which means there's not going to be a lot of carbonation. So that doesn't surprise me at all. The hops used in Europe are generally flavor profiled completely different than what we get here in the United States. So it doesn't surprise me that we have that banana taste in it, and the earthy is spot on. Like that's what I smell and taste.
And you don't grimace. You don't make a
Belgian
face
styles are not typically. Yeah. Belgian styles are not typically my favorite. I will say this is maybe one of, if not the most favorite Belgian style ale I've ever had. So I'm going to give it a slightly higher score. I'm going to give it a 7. If you like Belgian style ale, I think you will like this. And especially if you want one with some additional character that's not just that crisp, almost see-through look to it. You'll like this.
Well, with that, Tom, that's all for today. If you think you know a beer I'd like, or if you've got a FedRAMP question or another question, drop it in the comments below. And remember to like our LinkedIn and YouTube pages to hear live interviews with information security professionals. Thanks, everyone.